Okay. This evening, we get back to chapter 4 of the book of Revelation. Now, we have looked in the last week or so at several passages of Scripture that look at the timing and the circumstances about the rapture, and there's a comparison between the rapture and the second coming. One thing, the passages that we did look at pretty well discount, if we're true to Scripture, discounts the possibility of a post or after tribulation rapture. What we're left with as we look into chapter 4 is, does the tribulation happen before the rapture, or does it happen in the middle of the rapture? I know there's still some that will say, well, it happens mid-tribulation. Well, we're going to be actually looking, as we get into chapter 4, a couple of passages that pretty well narrow down what the Bible itself has to say about it. Now, if you look in chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, the first thing John says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a door open in heaven. And the first voice which I had heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things." Well, now, John has just spent 3 chapters telling us about the situation there where he was. He's Christ through him dictated 7 letters to each of these 7 churches. So when John and actually it's Jesus who he's quoting at this point that says, "Come up here and I'll show you what must take place after these things." Well, after what? Well, the context tells us that he's talking about the events of the previous couple of chapters, chapters 2 and 3, which take us through the history of the church. So the first conclusion we come to is, if in chapter 4 Jesus is saying, "Come up here, I'm going to show you what takes place after these things," well, clearly we're talking about after the church age. And chapters 4 and 5 describe the events there in the heavenly scene that involve the church. By the way, one thing I want you to watch for as we get into this, in the first part of the book of Revelation, in chapters 1, 2, and 3, the church is referred to, I believe it's 16 times that you can count some reference to the church in the first part of Revelation. Beginning in chapter 5, chapter 6. Beginning in chapter 6, there are no additional references to the church. Not till we get to the end of the book, when we're looking once again as God is coming back with the church. If there's no references to the church, especially the church on earth, beginning in chapter 6, well, guess what? That in itself points to the high probability that the church is not present on the earth during those things. And of course, the judgments begin pouring out. We'll look at those in chapter 6. Now, also notice here in verse 1, John says, he heard the sound of this voice like the sound of a trumpet, just like the first one that was speaking to him. Well, who was speaking to him at the beginning of the book that sounded like this booming trumpet? Jesus. And notice how John describes Jesus. He says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a door open in heaven." Well, who's the door to heaven?
Jesus.
Jesus. And in fact, one of the things Jesus said to John earlier on was, he's the door that I can open or is shut, and that I open and it can't be shut, or I shut it and it can't be opened. Yeah. What Jesus is saying is there aren't any other alternatives. He's it. So if John looks up and he says now he sees a door open in heaven, well, how do we get to heaven? Through Christ. And if Jesus is in heaven and Jesus is inviting John to come up here, well, if John is a representative of the church, and again, I realize that at this point, this is an interpretation, and we can't yet put our thumb down on this and say, this is the way it has to be, but clearly this at least points to the high likelihood that John, as a representative of the church, is being invited up to come up here. So that's one thing we see that points us in the direction of a rapture before the tribulation starts. Now, and by the way, notice when John looks, is the door to be opened, or what's the condition of the door when he looks?
Standing open.
It's already open. Exactly.
So is John saying that he was actually invited? I mean, did this actually happen with him for this writing? Is that?
I believe that's a safe assumption for us, because as we continue through the rest of the book of Revelation, John is telling all of this stuff from a first-person perspective. He says, and you can just watch for this as we get to it, but several times John says, I looked, or I saw. He doesn't say, well, there was. He says, I saw.
Okay.
And in fact, look what he says in verse 2. Right. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was standing in heaven, and one sitting on the throne. And he who was sitting was like a jasper stone and a sardius in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance. And by the way, I think we all are in agreement about the concept of, the rainbow about the throne. That's one of God's symbols, and I think we're all pretty much of the same mind about the way that the symbolism of the rainbow is being used today.
Right.
It's ungodly.
Weren't the stones had something to do with the priests and their vests that they wore?
The ephod?
Ephod.
Yeah, the ephod. There were stones in the ephod, but not, to my knowledge, not this particular type of stone. I think what you see here is, notice John is not saying that Jesus was a stone. Notice it says he who was sitting was like a jasper stone and a sardius in appearance. Well, what does that tell us? If these are, precious stones, precious, gems, when he sees Jesus, I think what he's telling us is that he's doing his best to try to describe the beauty of Christ that he sees. He's not saying that Jesus is. He said his appearance was like this. So I think he's doing the best he can with his vocabulary to describe the beauty of Christ. Now, and I think this warrants stopping here at this point and making this point here. John lived when?
In biblical times.
That really narrows it down.
In the time of Jesus Christ.
Well, the first century.
Yes. Okay.
This was written late in the first century. John did not, as we do, have a modern vocabulary. He couldn't describe modern machinery or modern warfare or events that I think that we see going on around us today. He literally did not have the vocabulary for it. Also, do any of us have the vocabulary to describe what heaven probably looks like?
No.
I venture to say not.
Haven't been there.
Haven't been there yet. However, we do know some people who have been there. Paul, for example, said that he was in the Spirit, that he saw heaven, and Paul didn't have the vocabulary to describe it. By the way, I want you to consider this. We're talking about vocabulary. Where did Paul get his education?
From Maya.
Gamaliel.
Gamaliel.
Gamaliel was one of the most famous rabbis of all times. Now, being educated in the school of Gamaliel, what does that tell us Paul was probably fluent in?
Greek.
Nope.
Hebrew.
Hebrew.
The other one.
That other language. Hebrew. Now, Paul was also a first century Jew. What was the general conversational language of Jews in the first century? It wasn't Hebrew, by the way. Aramaic. Now, why not Hebrew? Why Aramaic?
They had dealings with the world around them.
Well, not entirely, but it goes back to the exile in Babylon. Remember, they spent a couple of generations in Babylon, and what was the language of Babylon? Aramaic. So, by the time the Jews returned from captivity, after spending 70 plus years in the presence of the Babylonians, and of course, when you are captive in somebody else's country, what do they generally do to you as far as your native language?
They don't let you speak it.
Yeah, they
teach
beat it out
theirs.
of you.
Yeah, they teach you theirs.
So that's why the Jews lost the ability to speak Hebrew and began speaking Aramaic, except for the ones like Paul who were educated. So now back to Paul. Paul knew Hebrew and he could speak Aramaic. Now, because Paul was educated, and now we get to what you said, what was the general language, the language of commerce of the Mediterranean world during this period? Greek. And we know for a fact Paul could read and write Greek, because how many times do we see in Paul's epistles that he made a point of saying that this particular part of the letter I wrote myself with my own hand? There's several instances in his letters where he did that. And that was written in Greek.
Okay.
So,
Mine's written in English.
what was that?
I said mine's written in English.
Yeah. All right. Now,
Bad translation.
how many times did Paul have conversations with Roman officials, and there is no indication anywhere in the Bible that Paul had an interpreter present when he conversed with Roman officials? It says that he had one-on-one personal conversations with them. Now, if indeed he did that and there was no interpreter present, which frankly, I think if there had been, there'd be some indication of it. We have no mention of an interpreter anywhere. And the Romans' language was what? Latin.
He's an overachiever.
Somebody would say that. All right. Now here's my point. There is strong evidence to indicate Paul was at the very least conversant, if not fluent, in 4 different languages. Most of us are doing pretty good to get by with English, aren't we? Mm-hmm. Now, Paul describes a time when he found himself in the Spirit, in heaven, and with the vocabulary of 4 languages. Guess what Paul still could not do?
Describe what he saw.
He could not describe what he saw. What does that tell us about what we're going to see when we get to heaven?
Indescribable.
Indescribable. If Paul did not have the vocabulary to describe what he saw, I don't think any of us are either. Now, my point in going there was all this. As we continue through the book of Revelation, take with a grain of salt. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying to dismiss what John is saying. Absolutely, I am not saying that. What I am saying is the way that John describes things, take that with a grain of salt, in the sense that, unlike Paul, John probably didn't even have this much vocabulary. We know John could read and write Hebrew in all probability. He knew Aramaic, and clearly he knew enough Greek to be able to write in Greek. So John was not ignorant by any means. Was he as good at it as Paul? Probably not. Because Paul had an education. As far as we know, the one thing that was known about the disciples of Christ was they were known for being just common people that didn't have an education. So John probably had the equivalent of maybe what today we would consider having been a high school graduate with a little bit of college thrown in here and there. Anyway, John, as we continue in Revelation, is trying to describe events that we know, several of which occur in yet our future. Imagine the difference in how society, how the world has changed, and the vocabulary that has been added to the world even in just our last 100 years. We've got computers, nuclear weapons, military, electronics. I mean, you name it, things that weren't even imagined in the time of John. So when John describes some of the things that we see in the book of Revelation, keep in mind he's using the vocabulary of someone who lived 2,000 years ago to describe events that are yet in our future. For example, and I'll give you an example. I think there's one spot in the Bible, in the Revelation, that we'll get to. It sounds to me like, and I'm not going to show you which one that is because we're going to get to it soon enough. But there's one spot that it almost sounds like John is describing a modern day attack helicopter. He talks about this thing where he can see it has the head of a man. And when you're looking at someone who's right, any of you ever seen pictures or have actually seen an Apache, or generation ago they were Cobra helicopters. It's an attack helicopter. Did you ever see? How much of the pilot can you see of that if you're looking at it?
The head.
All you can see is from here up. The rest is obscured. And that helicopter's got these pods, weapons pods that stick out on the side. And of course it's got a blade on there. How do you think somebody who doesn't even have the vocabulary to describe a machine would describe something like that? Got the head of a man, got stingers on it. I mean, you can just imagine some of the things that John would probably come up to, or the vocabulary he would use trying to describe something like that. So we're going to see a lot of that as we go.
Well, how about the jasper stone and the sardis? Do you know what those are or what they look like?
Off the top of my head, now that you ask me that, off the top of my head, no. I know they're precious stones, but now what specifically they look like, I couldn't tell you.
We're all gonna Google tonight.
Go right on ahead. All right, now let's get back to our passage of scripture here. By the way, in verse 3, when it just says there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance. By the way, I do know that an emerald's green. Now, what was the rainbow a promise of?
Never to flood the world again.
Not just to flood the world, but why not to flood the world?
Destroy it.
What's that?
To destroy it.
To destroy it, because we're talking judgment. God said that he judged the world by a flood the first time.
Oh, that's
And
right. Yeah.
God did not promise that he would never again judge the world. What he said is he would never again judge the world through water.
Okay.
This is a promise here or a reminder to the church, there will not be a judgment by water. And I think that's important in this context because what immediately after chapters 4 and 5 begins?
Tribulation.
Judgments. Judgment after judgment after judgment. But God is reminding us it won't be by water.
Fire scares me.
And that's going to be one of them. All right. Now, verse 4. This is important. And around the throne were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white garments and golden crowns on their head. Now, there is absolutely no place in the Bible anywhere that describes angels as being crowned or of any royalty. It does describe them as being in charge. There's times where we see angels ruling in various issues or various situations, but notice here it says these 24 elders had crowns on their heads. By the way, and this is again something you're just going to have to trust me on this one, because it's a difference in the Greek language. There's two different words that are used for crown in the Greek language. The one that's consistently used of Jesus and his crown is diadema. Now, where do you what word in English you think we get from diadema? Diadem. That is not the word that is used here of these 24 elders. The word that is used of these 24 elders is a Stephanos. But by the way, we get the name Stephen from that. So if you know anybody named Stephen, you can tell them their name literally means crown. However, here's the difference. A diadem or a diadema is a crown of royalty. That is not what a Stephanos is. A Stephanos, which is what it says these 24 elders has, is a crown of, anybody want to guess? Reward. If we have 24 elders around the throne wearing a crown of reward, what does that tell you?
The rapture is occurred.
Not only the rapture, but what else?
The judgment.
The judgment. From verse 1 to verse 4, John has compacted the story together that the rapture and judgment have already occurred. Now, one of the reasons this is important, first off, numerous times I have people ask us, how in the world is God going to judge the billions of Christians over all of history? And again, we're talking the worldwide judgment, might not be just the church. And again, I say might not because we're going to get into the issue of the resurrection of the pre-Christian saints as we go along. But my personal opinion is I think they will be resurrected at the same time, although there's some disagreements on that. But if we're looking at the judgment of godly Christian humanity for all of time, we're talking several billion people. People ask, well, isn't that going to take an awfully long time? Folks, when we say that about God, we are putting God in a box that God doesn't live in. We're thinking of God in our terms because we live in this thing called time. Is God limited by time?
No.
God can make whatever he wants happen like that. By the way, this isn't biblical what I'm about to tell you, but I know probably all of you have heard similar stories of this and you can relate to this. I've read many a story of people who have said they've had near-death experiences, and even those who did not actually die, but they thought they were going to die. And what's one of the things that's, you hear stories about people saying it happens to them in an instant.
Life passes by.
Yes,
Right.
I've read numerous stories of people saying, I thought I was going to die, or this happened, I had a wreck, or this happened, and I saw my life flash before me. Well, if God can do that to some individual who just thinks he's going to die or has a near-death experience, and by the way, it isn't just that their life flashes by. Everybody who has described scenes like that say not only did they see their life flash by in an instant, but in that instant, the one common denominator that goes along with that is they all say that even though it happened just in a twinkling of an eye, that they were able to actually make out every single detail for the entirety of their life. Not just, what was that? It wasn't one of those. It's like they actually saw every single detail of their life, and it happened just like that. Folks, God is not limited by our concept of time. We worry about or think the judgment's going to take all this time. Folks, the judgment's going to be over and done with. And it isn't going to be something that, again, in our perception, that's going to be, oh, well, that happened quick, no deal there. I think for us, it's all going to be a proclamation that will be public. We'll all experience it. We'll all see it. We'll all celebrate together. But from our concept of time, it's going to happen just like that. God hasn't got to worry about how many of us there are or how much time there is. And for that matter, let's look at it from this perspective. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that God does take us one at a time, and we go through all that, and another. Do you not also realize that God could very well do that, and as time passes by on the earth, could be, earth time could go by in an hour, and we could experience a lifetime in heaven. Don't put God in a box by our physical limitations. God has no such limitations. But now back to the passage of Scripture. The fact that it says they had these crowns on their head, this indeed tells us judgment has occurred. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, there's nowhere in the Bible that says anything about angels having a crown. Certainly not a crown of reward. So if these 24 elders have crowns, not only does it tell us that judgment has occurred, but it tells us something else very significant has indeed occurred right here before the tribulation begins. And guess what that is?
Rapture.
The rapture. Judgment can't occur unless what else occurs? The rapture. Judgment's not going to occur and us still be here. Folks, that right there, verse 4, tells you the rapture indeed has occurred. It did not occur at the midpoint. It did not even occur at the beginning of the tribulation. Tribulation, as far in our study, doesn't even begin until chapter 6. This happens before the tribulation occurs. The world is left behind and the earth has been taken out. Now, this may be as far as we get tonight on this verse 4 here, but that's all right. I think we need to take some time, make sure that we understand everything. I'm going to ask, if you will, look in Luke chapter 14. In Luke 14, verse 14, Jesus says this, and again, this is Luke 14:14, and you will be blessed since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Once again, this tells us that the fact that they are receiving the signs of their spiritual reward, Jesus just says that won't happen till the resurrection of the righteous. Now, one other passage of Scripture. Look in 1 Peter chapter 5. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4, it says, and when the chief shepherd appears, guess what you receive? You will receive the unfading crown of glory. That, guess what? In the original Greek, guess what kind of crown that was? A Stephanos. Exactly what it says those 24 elders were wearing. All right. Also, let's look at some other possibilities. By the way, we're going to finish up tonight with just verse 4 as far as we're going to get. Notice it says these 24 elders were seated upon thrones. If these were saints who had not yet been given their resurrection body, how can you sit on a throne if you have no body? Ever thought about that? The fact that they're seated on a throne doesn't just say they have a throne, it says they're seated on a throne. By being seated, again, it is an indication that you have what? A body. And we know that before the resurrection, those who have departed, they don't have bodies. Because what does Paul say about if we're absent, what? From the body, present with the Lord. So yes, when we die physically, we will be present with God, but what Paul is also saying is that in that interim period of time between our physical death and our resurrection, we're not going to have physical bodies. They don't have a body. But if these 24 elders are seated on a throne, they've got a body, or else they wouldn't be able to sit on that throne.
Or be clothed in white garments.
Or be clothed in white garments. Thank you. That was the next thing. You just covered it. Well, we are going to look at the identity of these 24 elders, but that in itself is probably going to take us 10 or 15 minutes. So why don't we wind it up there, and we'll pick up with the identity of these 24 elders on Wednesday night. What's that?
Can I read something real quick?
Go ahead. You
I
have
have
plenty of time.
I have a, I don't know what you call it, it's got explanations underneath the verses, commentary Bible. Who are the 24 elders that it talks about in verse 4? Because there were 24 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament and 12 apostles in the New Testament, 24 elders in the vision probably represents the redeemed of God for all time, both before and after Christ's death and the resurrection. They symbolize all those, both Jew and Gentiles. My eyes aren't that good anymore. From both, they symbolize those, both Jew and Gentile, who are now part of the glory of God, God's family. The 24 elders show us that they redeemed of the Lord's who are worshiping Him.
And that is one of the very strong possibilities as to their identity. And like I said, we're going to get in a lot deeper into that Wednesday evening, but you're on the right track with that. And I would not disagree with anything that your commentary there says. All right. Anybody else? All right. Well, let's see if our music will work this evening. Mario.